On a cold November morning in 1274, the sea itself began to move, not with waves, not with wind, with war. From the cliffs of Tsushima, fishermen were the first to see it. A dark stain on the horizon. At first they thought it was weather. A low storm bank rolling unnaturally straight across the water. But storms do not move in formation. Storms do not carry banners. By sunrise. The truth was undeniable. 900 ships, 900, their hulls built in Korean shipyards. Their sails cut by Chinese craftsmen. Their decks crowded with armored silhouettes standing shoulder to shoulder. 20,000 warriors, 15,000 horses, drums echoing across the water like a heartbeat from hell. The Mongol Empire had arrived at that moment in history. The Mongols were not just powerful, they were inevitable. From the plains of Mongolia, they had erupted like wildfire across Eurasia. Cities burned, kingdoms vanished, entire civilizations erased so completely that historians still debate their final moments. In just 50 years, they had conquered nearly a quarter of the known world. From Poland to Persia, from Siberia to the South China Sea, they had never been stopped. And now their ships cut through the morning mist toward a small island that most of the empire's generals had never even heard of, Tsushima, a narrow strip of land between Korea and Japan. 271 square miles of forests, farms, and fishing villages. No great castles, no towering walls, no massive garrisons. Just one thin line of samurai families who had never fought a war bigger than a clan, feud. 80 mounted warriors. That was all that stood between the Mongol war machine and mainland Japan. 80 against 20,000. But this story does not begin on the beach. It begins 6 years earlier, in 1268, when a letter arrived in Japan. The parchment bore the seal of a man who ruled more land than any emperor in history, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, master of China, lord of the largest empire the world had ever seen. The message was simple: submit, acknowledge Mongol supremacy, pay tribute, open trade, accept your place beneath the eternal blue sky. Or be destroyed. The letter was read in Kamakura before the young regent Hojo Tokumin. He was barely in his 20s. The Mongols expected fear. They expected negotiation. They expected tribute like every other kingdom had eventually offered. Instead, Japan did something no one else had dared. They said nothing. The envoys were dismissed without response. Kublai Khan sent another delegation. This time the reply was clearer. The envoys were beheaded, their heads displayed as a message to the greatest empire on earth. Japan would never kneel. It was bold. It was reckless. It was insane. Because Japan in 1274 was not ready for war, there was no standing national army, no centralized military command. Samurai clans fought each other more often than they trained together. Their warfare was ritualized, personal, almost theatrical. A warrior would ride forward, announce his lineage, recite his achievements, and challenge an enemy to honorable single combat. That was how Japan fought. The Mongols did not fight that way. The Mongols fought like a machine. Disciplined formations. Coordinated drum signals. Massed arrow volleys. Feigned retreats. Encirclements. Gunpowder bombs that exploded with thunder and shrapnel. Composite bows that could kill at 350 meters, triple the range of Japanese bows. The difference between them was not small. It was generational, technological, philosophical, and standing at the center of this impossible equation was a man history remembers too simply as Osukakuni, Lord of Tsushima. 41 years old, a regional noble with 80 mounted samurai under his command. Some chronicles call him stubborn. Others call him foolish, a relic clinging to outdated honor codes in the face of modern warfare. But the records hide something else. He understood something no Mongol general did. Some battles are not meant to be won. Some battles are meant to be witnessed. When the first confirmed sighting of the Mongol armada reached Tsushima's watchtower, Sukakuni did not call for retreat. He did not send frantic pleas for reinforcements. He did not barricade himself in some feudal defensive position. Instead, he gathered his 80 samurai. They met in silence. Not to plan victory, to prepare for death. They purified themselves in cold water. They burned incense. They wrote death poems, short, final reflections on impermanence. They sent quiet goodbyes to wives, to children, to ancestors. This was not desperation, it was calculation. Because Sukekuni had already studied the geography of his island. Tsushima had no walls, no natural choke points strong enough to resist 20,000 men. If the Mongols landed, the island would fall. But if it fell too easily, Japan would panic. If it fell too quietly, Japan would underestimate the threat. If it fell with terror, Japan might fracture. As Sukekuni made a decision that still echoes through military history. They would fight on the beach. In full view. They would not retreat inland. They would not hide in forests. They would stand where the Mongols could see them point 80 against 20,000, not to stop the invasion. Tito sent a message that on the night before the landing, villagers were ordered to evacuate. Crops burned, storehouses destroyed, wells fouled. Everything that could feed an army turned to ash. Smoke would greet the invaders. And at dawn, on November 4th, 1274, the drums began. From the cliffs, the samurai watched the fleet assemble into attack formation. The sound rolled over the water, deep synchronized war drums beating from ship to ship, turning the sea itself into a rhythm of conquest. Horses beneath the samurai shifted nervously, and one spoke. They could see the banners now. Mongol standards snapping in the wind. Korean Marines lining the rails. Chinese engineers adjusting strange cylindrical devices. Thunder crash bombs filled with black powder. The largest invasion fleet the world had ever seen was aiming directly at their shore point. One of Sukekuni's generals finally broke the silence. We can retreat inland. Use terrain. Force them into narrow paths. It was logical that IT was smart, that IT was survivable. Sukekuni shook his head. We fight where they land. The answer stunned them. If we retreat, he continued, they will think us afraid. If we hide, they will think us weak. But if we die in front of them, if we show them what waits in Japan, they will hesitate. He turned his gaze back to the horizon. And hesitation is worth more than survival. At 5:47 a.m., the first light revealed the full scale of the armada. 900 ships stretched across the horizon like a floating city of war. The sea did not look blue anymore. Akati looked armored. T6:15 a.m. Landing craft lowered. BY 7:30 a.m. The first Mongol soldiers stepped onto Komoda Beach. The invasion of Japan had begun, and 80 samurai waited in a single line. Their armor polished, their banners upright, their faces calm. Not because they believed they would win, but because they intended to make the world remember how they died. The Mongol landing craft scraped against Komoda Beach just after sunrise, wood grinding against sand like teeth against bone. For a moment, just a moment, there was silence. Then the drums stopped, and the first Mongol boots touched Japanese soil. They came in waves. Tight formation. Shields interlocked, banners rising behind them. Korean Marines securing the shoreline while Mongol archers stepped forward in perfect lines, already knocking arrows before their feet were fully planted in the sand. From the Japanese line, 80 mounted samurai watched without moving, in nervous shifting, in panicked whispers. Just stillness. The Mongols expected screaming charges. They expected desperate resistance. Instead, they found 80 figures standing in ceremonial alignment, like statues placed there for ritual. Hong Daegu, observing from a forward command vessel offshore, narrowed his eyes. Why do they wait? He asked his interpreter. The reply came uncertainly. They are preparing themselves. For what? The answer arrived at 7:42 a.m. From a Japanese line, one rider broke formation. He was young, barely more than a boy, 16 years old. Taira no Noritaka. The youngest of the 80. His horse walked forward at a controlled pace, hooves pressing clean prints in untouched sand. He stopped halfway between the two armies. He raised his bow, and he began to speak. He announced his lineage, his father's name, his grandfather's battles, the province he served, the honor he carried, his challenge to any Mongol warrior brave enough to meet him in single combat. His voice carried across the quiet beach. The Mongols stared in confusion. This was not how they fought. There was no answering champion and a warrior riding forward. Instead, a drumbeat, sharp point, 3 rapid strikes. The Mongol archers lifted in perfect synchronization. The sky darkened. The first volley loosed, 1,000 arrows screamed forward. Taira no Noritaka never finished his final sentence. The shaft struck him mid-breath, punching through armor, through flesh, through bone. His horse collapsed beneath him, shrieking as more arrows buried into its flank. The young samurai hit the sand, already dead, pinned upright for a heartbeat by the sheer number of shafts embedded in his body. The Mongol lines remained disciplined, and cheering, and chaos. Just efficiency. But something subtle shifted. The remaining 79 samurai did not move. They did not break. They did not panic. They simply watched their youngest brother die. And then, calmly, another rider stepped forward. He repeated the ritual lineage. Honor. Challenge. The Mongols answered with arrows again. And again. And again. Each time a single samurai rode forward to be annihilated under a storm of projectiles. To Mongol commanders, it looked like madness to Tito Sukakuni. It was stagecraft. Every death forced the Mongols to stop and respond. Every ceremonial announcement consumed minutes. Every arrow volley required coordination and supply. Every fallen warrior showed something the Mongols had not encountered before. Men who did not adapt. Men who did not retreat. Men who chose visible death over invisible survival. Why 8:30 a.m., 23 samurai lay dead on the beach. The Mongol beachhead expanded steadily. Shield walls locked together. Engineers began unloading thunder crash bombs. Korean infantry secured flanks. The technological mismatch was brutal. When the first thunder bomb detonated near the Japanese horses, the explosion cracked across the sand like divine wrath. Smoke and shrapnel ripped through armor gaps. One samurai was thrown clear from his saddle without an arrow ever touching him. His ears bled. He did not rise. The Mongols advanced, but behind the samurai, Tsushima was burning. Thick black smoke rolled upward from torched villages. Storehouses collapsed in flame. Crops smoldered into ash. The Mongols noticed. There would be no easy plundered, and captured food, and comfort for victory. Just smoke. At T9:05 a.m., Sukakuni raised his war fan. The ritual charges stopped. The remaining 57 samurai pulled back into a single line. Not staggered, not defensive, but a straight ceremonial line. Hong Daga squinted through the smoke. What are they doing now? The interpreter swallowed. They appear to be forming for a unified charge. That would be suicide. The interpreter hesitated. Yes. On the Japanese side, the horses shifted in unison. 57 riders. Every man fully aware that what came next would end his life. But this was the part that mattered. Sukakuni turned slightly in his saddle, looking down the line at the men who had grown beside him. Fought beside him. Laughed beside him. Remember, he said quietly, they must see. Not win. Not survive. C.8 T10:27 a.m. The war fan dropped. The beach exploded. The 57 horses surged forward at full gallop, sand erupting behind them. The roar of their charge tore through the air, not a scream of desperation, but a declaration. Each rider shouting his name, his clan, his ancestry, his children's names, as if carving identity into the wind. The Mongol drums reacted instantly. 3 coordinated volleys. First at distance. Arrows tore into the front ranks. Horses tumbled. Riders flipped forward in sprays of sand and blood. Second volley at 100 meters. More fell. Third volley at 50 meters. Point-blank devastation. But 31 samurai did not fall. 31 riders broke through the arrow storm and crashed directly into the Mongol front line. And suddenly the mathematics fractured, because Mongol formations were dense. Built for synchronized archery. Built for collective strength. They were not built for 31 elite mounted killers inside their ranks. Katanas flashed in tight arcs. Naginata blades swept horizontally, ripping through shield joints. Horses slammed into infantry formations with explosive force. For a moment, a terrifying, disorienting moment. The Mongol line bent. Friendly fire became a threat. Archers hesitated. Infantry stumbled over fallen comrades. The clean, mechanical rhythm of invasion stuttered. A samurai cut down 3 men in one sweep before a spear took his horse through the throat. As the animal collapsed, he rose from beneath it, already bleeding from 2 arrow wounds, and continued on foot. Another rider lost his mount, rolled across the sand, and stood laughing as he charged into a cluster of Mongol infantry twice his size. This was not efficient warfare. This was theater soaked in blood. At T-10:34 a.m., a Mongol officer fell. Then another. Then another. The Mongols still held overwhelming superiority. Their numbers were suffocating. But something unexpected began to ripple through their ranks. Hesitation. These men were not begging for life. They were fighting as if death was the objective. A wounded samurai, arrows protruding from his back, dragged himself forward and drove his blade into the ankle of a Mongol commander before collapsing. Another, pinned to his knees, continued slashing until 3 spears ended him simultaneously. The Mongol withdrawal drums sounded briefly, not retreat, but repositioning to avoid internal chaos. But the samurai did something incomprehensible. They dismounted voluntarily, on foot, I in heavy armor, I in sand. They charged deeper. Hong Daegu stared in disbelief. "They want to die among us," the interpreter whispered. "Yes," Hong Daegu answered slowly. "They do." By 10:50 a.m., the thunder crash bombs resumed. Explosions tore into the clustered samurai. Concussive blasts knocked men off their feet. Poison arrows found every joint in lacquered armor. One by one, the 31 dwindled, but every death required effort. Every kill demanded resources. Every fallen samurai left behind multiple Mongol bodies. By 11 a.m., only 12 remained standing. 12, surrounded by thousands. And they were closer to the Mongol command position than anyone had expected possible. Sukekuni, bleeding from multiple wounds, spotted a banner through the smoke. The Korean General Kim Bong-yong's standard. He did not turn away. He pointed. The 12 formed a wedge, and they ran directly at it. Not because they could win, but because they needed the general to see their faces. See the message. This is only the beginning. The 12 did not scream when they charged this time. Their voices were gone. Their throats burned raw from smoke and salt and blood. They ran in silence. Armor cracked, banners torn away, faces streaked red and black, cutting forward through a forest of enemy spears toward the Korean command standard, snapping above the chaos. Around them, Mongol infantry tightened ranks, elite guards stepping forward in disciplined formation, shields locking, pikes lowering, archers shifting angles for clear shots. But the 12 did not slow. Sukekuni limped at the front, one leg trailing slightly from a deep gash in his thigh. Yet his blade still moved with terrifying precision, cutting a path not wide, but direct, every strike deliberate, every step intentional, as if he were walking a road he had already chosen days ago. A spear glanced off his shoulder plate, another sliced across his ribs, an arrow struck and lodged beneath his arm, but he kept moving. To his left, one of his lieutenants took a pike through the stomach, pulled himself forward along the shaft to reach the man holding it, killed him at arm's length, then collapsed without a sound. Behind them, thunder crash bombs detonated again, the concussive blasts flattening sand and bodies alike. But even the explosions felt delayed now, reactive rather than dominant. The Mongols were no longer advancing. They were containing. That alone was disruption. That alone was delay. They reached 30 meters from the command banner before the final wall formed. 300 guards in layered formation, fresh, uninjured, disciplined. Against them stood 12 exhausted men, barely able to remain upright. It should have ended instantly. Instead, it dragged. Every samurai fought as if time itself was the weapon. One dropped to his knees after losing his hand and still used the stump of his arm to hook an enemy shield aside for the man behind him. Another struck through the neck, held the spear in place so it could not be withdrawn, and used his final strength to step forward, forcing his killer backward into his own ranks. Mongol officers shouted for space, for distance, for formation integrity. But the fight had collapsed into close quarters where drills meant less than nerve. Sukekuni cut down a guard who rushed too quickly, then another who underestimated the reach of his blade, and for a brief suspended second, he locked eyes with Kim Bangyong himself. There is no fear in Sukekuni's gaze, and no rage either, only certainty. That was what unsettled the general. These men were not trying to survive. They were trying to communicate. Every step forward said the same thing. If this is one island, what waits on the mainland? A sword struck Sukekuni from the side, slicing deep into his wounded leg. He dropped to one knee. A spear pierced his side. Another blade cut across his back. He did not fall immediately. He planted his sword in the sand to steady himself, lifted his head, and continued to stare toward the command banner as if finishing a conversation that did not require words. Around him, the last of the 12 were cut down one by one, crushed under sheer mass, pierced by coordinated thrusts, buried under shields and boots. By 11:19 a.m., Sukekuni's body finally gave way. He fell forward, still facing the enemy, armor riddled with wounds, white funeral cloth visible beneath the plates. By 11:24 a.m., it was over .80 samurai lay dead. The beach belonged to the Mongols, and yet nothing felt victorious. The silence that followed was not triumph, but recalibration. Officers began casualty counts, expecting negligible losses. The numbers returned wrong. Over 300 dead, nearly 200 more wounded, dozens of junior officers among them, men who had led from the front and been specifically targeted in the chaos. For an engagement against 80 defenders, it was inefficient, disruptive, embarrassing. Worse, it had taken nearly 4 hours. The timetable had called for rapid subjugation, establishment of a forward base, inland penetration before dusk. Instead, the army stood on a smoldering beach littered with bodies, arrows expended in staggering quantity, thunderbomb reserves significantly reduced, horses unsettled by sand and smoke. And then came the detail that unsettled them further. The bodies of the samurai had not fallen randomly. Even in death, they lay angled inland, their last charge direction forming a subtle arrow pointing toward the Japanese mainland. Some had died in kneeling posture, blades still raised. Several had strips of white cloth sewn deliberately beneath their armor, funeral garments worn in advance. These men had come expecting this exact end. That realization traveled through the ranks faster than any official report. Conscripted Chinese infantry whispered that the islanders must be spirits. Korean sailors muttered about cursed shores. The idea began to circulate quietly. If the outer island fought like this, what horrors waited deeper inside? Instead of immediate advance, commanders ordered consolidation. Secure the perimeter. Burn remaining structures. Eliminate stragglers. The Mongols executed elderly civilians who had refused evacuation, mounted heads on spears as warning, torched what little remained. They believed terror would soften what lay ahead. They did not understand that scouts were watching from the hills, memorizing everything. They did not know that among the dead samurai were armor plates scratched with notes, technical observations carved before battle, arrow volleys strongest at mid-range, shield walls vulnerable at joint overlap, bombs detonate after visible spark delay. Sukekuni had turned his men into reconnaissance instruments. They had not only fought, they had studied while dined at By mid-afternoon. A surviving fishing boat slipped away under smoke cover, carrying news to the mainland. Tsushima had fallen, all defenders dead, enemy numbers confirmed beyond anything Japan had imagined. But attached to the horror was something unexpected. They bleed. They could be delayed. Their officers can be reached. Their formations can be broken in close quarters. The message spread faster than fear. In temples, in clan halls, in coastal watch posts, the story shifted from annihilation to defiance. 80 men had not stopped the invasion, but they had changed its rhythm. On the beach that evening, Mongol soldiers sat among the dead and felt something unfamiliar: doubt. They had conquered cities with walls higher than any in Japan. They had crushed armies 10 times the size of Tsushima's defenders. Yet these 80 had fought as if death were a resource to be spent deliberately. That thought lingered as night approached and signal fires flickered faintly on distant Japanese mountains across the water, patterns suggesting movement, organization, readiness. The Mongol generals could not know whether those lights marked 10,000 warriors or simple illusion. But after Komoda Beach, imagination became an enemy of its own. The invasion had succeeded tactically. Strategically, something had shifted. The clock was no longer theirs alone. WY's sunset the beach no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like a warning. The tide had begun to creep in, touching armor plates, rocking lifeless horses, washing blood into the sand as if trying to erase what had happened. But nothing about that day could be erased. Mongol soldiers moved through the bodies collecting arrows, stripping valuables, confirming kills. Yet even in routine, there was unease. Too many of the dead samurai had fallen facing forward. Too many had died with expressions that did not resemble defeat. Kim Bang-yong walked the shoreline personally, boots darkened by wet sand and ash. He had seen massacres across China. He had crushed rebellions in mountains and cities. But this felt different. This was not a desperate stand from trapped men. This had been orchestrated, deliberate. The white burial cloth sewn beneath armor disturbed him most. They had dressed for their own funerals before the first arrow flew. That was not battlefield panic. That was premeditation. Behind him, casualty reports continued to adjust upward. 312 confirmed dead. More succumbing to wounds as medics worked through the evening. 43 officers lost. The numbers were not catastrophic in isolation, but against 80 defenders they were mathematically uncomfortable. The ratio was wrong. Efficiency had faltered. Supplies had been consumed at a higher rate than projected. Nearly 40,000 arrows expended. A significant portion of thunder crash bombs used in what should have been a minor coastal clearing operation. And time. Time was the most dangerous loss of all. The invasion schedule had been precise. Tsushima was to be secured within hours, converted into a forward base. Horses rested briefly, then immediate sail toward the next objective. Momentum was essential. Shock and speed were the Empire's greatest weapons. Instead, the army now sat on a smoldering island, reorganizing. As darkness deepened, whispers spread through the ranks. Conscripted Chinese infantry who had been pressed into service-traded stories in low voices. One swore he had seen a samurai continue fighting after losing half his face. Another insisted a warrior had smiled while arrows pierced his chest. Exaggerations multiplied, but fear does not require accuracy. It feeds on suggestion. Korean sailors aboard anchored ships stared toward the Japanese mainland and spoke of spirits guarding the waters. The psychological infection had begun. Then the signal fires appeared. Across the strait, faint at first, then multiplying along the ridge lines of Kyushu. Not random flames, but patterns, deliberate spacing, rising one after another like a chain of awakening eyes. To Mongol observers, they suggested coordination on a scale larger than anticipated. Perhaps Japan was more unified than intelligence had indicated. Perhaps reinforcements were already mobilizing. What the Mongols could not know was that the first detailed report from Tsushima had already reached the mainland. A small fishing vessel, slipping past patrols under cover of smoke and night, carried 2 surviving scouts and a blood-stained armor plate scratched with notes. They arrived breathless at Hakata Bay long after midnight. The message was blunt: Tsushima destroyed, 80 samurai dead, enemy numbers overwhelming. But the tone was not despairing. It was instructional. The Mongols fire in disciplined volleys at mid-range, close the distance quickly. Their bombs explode after visible spark. Count the heartbeat before impact. Their shield walls can fracture under mounted impact at seam joints. Their cavalry struggles in soft sand and narrow terrain. Target officers, disrupt drums. The report transformed horror into preparation. Hojo Tokimyan received the news before dawn. He did not weep for Tsushima. He did not rage. He ordered mobilization. Samurai clans that had feuded for generations were summoned with a single command. The outer shield has fallen. Now the wall must stand. And for the first time in decades, rival banners began moving in the same direction. Back on Tsushima, the Mongol High Command debated through the night. Some urged immediate continuation at first light to preserve initiative. Others advised consolidation, rest, and psychological recalibration. The image of 12 men nearly reaching the command position lingered heavily. If a mere island lord could drive so deep, what resistance might a major regional army offer? Caution W. Owen A. T. Dawn on November 5th. Instead of sailing immediately, the Mongols spent hours reorganizing, tending wounded, re-establishing supply lines, and completing the systematic destruction of Tsushima. Villages were burned fully, fields trampled, survivors executed. The brutality was meant to send a countermessage. Resistance is futile. But the intended terror traveled differently once it crossed the water. On the mainland, the atrocities hardened resolve rather than shattered it. The story spread that Tsushima's warriors had died to the last man and had made the invaders bleed for every step. Their sacrifice became proof that the Mongols were not gods. 3 days passed before the fleet finally advanced toward Hakata Bay. 3 days that should not have been lost. 3 days during which defensive positions were strengthened, coastal watchposts reinforced, samurai contingents gathered in numbers the Mongols had not expected. The beach fortifications were crude compared to continental stone cities, but they were ready. Trenches dug, stakes placed, signals coordinated. Lessons from Komoda Beach whispered from commander to commander. When the Mongol fleet approached Hakata, they did not find a scattered feudal coastline. They found organized resistance waiting in depth, and beneath every helmet, behind every bowstring drawn, there was the same image burned into memory. 80 men standing in a single line on a windswept beach, choosing visible death over invisible surrender. The Mongols still possessed overwhelming strength. They still held technological superiority, but something subtle had shifted in the balance. Confidence had cracked. Doubt had entered calculation. Every formation now carried the memory of 31 riders breaking through impossible odds. Every drumbeat echoed against the silence that followed Sukakuni's final charge. The invasion continued, but it was no longer unstoppable. When the Mongol fleet finally moved again, the sea was calmer than it had been on the morning of Tsushima, but the mood aboard the ships was not. The drums still beat. The banners still flew. 20,000 men still filled the decks. Yet something intangible had shifted. The memory of Komoda Beach traveled with them like an unseen passenger. As the armada approached Hakata Bay on Kyushu, the Mongol commanders expected the same pattern. Panic scattered defenders, quick establishment of a beachhead. Instead, as morning mist lifted, they saw something unexpected stretching along the shoreline. Lines, not 80 men, hundreds, then thousands, samurai banners fluttered in organized ranks. Infantry units positioned deliberately along defensive points. Stakes embedded in sand to disrupt cavalry. Archers placed behind shallow earthworks. The coastline no longer looked like an isolated frontier. It looked prepared. News of Tsushima had done exactly what Sukakuni intended. It had unified. Clans that had once fought each other over rice fields and inheritance disputes now stood shoulder to shoulder. Rival lords who had refused to cooperate for years now shared signal codes and defensive plans. They did not come because they believed they would win easily. They came because 80 men had shown them what resistance looked like. The Mongol landing began anyway. The first wave of ships lowered troops into the surf under covering arrow fire. Composite bows loosed in synchronized volleys, arrows arcing farther than Japanese archers were accustomed to seeing. Thunder crash bombs were prepared again, engineers calculating angles to clear defensive clusters. But the Japanese did not repeat Tsushima's ritual. They adapted. Instead of single champions riding forward to announce lineage, arrows answered arrows immediately. The distance closed faster. Samurai cavalry units waited for optimal moments rather than charging ceremonially. Drums and conch shells coordinated movements across the defensive line. The Mongols hit resistance the moment their boots touched sand. The first clashes were brutal and chaotic. Mongol infantry attempted to form dense shield walls, but the Japanese had studied the seams. Targeted strikes aimed at joints, at officers, at drum carriers. Whenever a Mongol commander raised his signal banner too high, he became a focal point for arrows. The technological gap still existed. Thunder bombs exploded among defenders, sending shockwaves through formations. Poisoned arrows inflicted wounds that turned fatal hours later. Mongol discipline remained formidable, but the psychological equation had changed. Mongol soldiers expected opponents who would break after witnessing Tsushima's destruction. Instead, they found men eager to emulate it. Several samurai deliberately forced close quarters to neutralize arrow range. Mounted units charged not in scattered honor duels, but in coordinated bursts designed to fracture specific segments of the Mongol line before withdrawing quickly. They did not try to hold ground recklessly. They inflicted damage and pulled back. The lessons had been absorbed in days. By afternoon, neither side held decisive advantage of the shoreline. The Mongols had secured partial footholds, but every advance cost them more than projections allowed. Casualties mounted steadily. Arrows were expended faster than planned. Bomb reserves dwindled again. Night approached that on the Mongol side, standard doctrine called for consolidation and pressing advantage at dawn. But the memory of Tsushima lingered in command tents. The idea of pushing deep inland without fully assessing the scale of Japanese mobilization felt riskier than before. Report from scouts indicated large defensive gatherings further inland. Whether those numbers were accurate or inflated by fear, no one could confirm. So they chose caution again. As darkness fell, Mongol forces withdrew to their ships for the night, a tactical decision rooted in naval strength and desire to regroup. Ships anchored in the bay, torches flickering across decks, silhouettes moving against lantern light. Onshore, Japanese forces did not celebrate. They reinforced positions through the night, repaired damaged lines, tended wounded, rotated archers. Priests moved quietly through camps offering blessings, invoking spirits, speaking of Tsushima's 80 as guardians watching from beyond. Offshore, the Mongol fleet rode the water in tight formation, and then the weather began to shift. First it was subtle, a stronger wind than forecast. Sail lines creaking under tension, clouds gathering faster than usual over the dark horizon. Korean sailors glanced uneasily at the sky. Autumn storms were not uncommon in these waters, but the timing felt ominous. The wind intensified past midnight. Anchored ships strained against moorings. Smaller vessels bumped hulls with hollow thunder. Commanders ordered adjustments, but coordination across hundreds of ships in darkness was imperfect. Signals grew harder to read as lanterns flickered violently in gusts. Then the storm hit. Not a gentle squall, but a violent, sudden assault of wind and rain that turned the bay into chaos. Waves rose sharply, slamming hulls sideways. Anchors tore loose from seabeds. Ships collided, splintering wood against wood. Horses below deck panicked. Adding weight shifts that destabilized vessels further. Men shouted over roaring wind, trying to cut lines, trying to re-anchor, trying to avoid crushing neighboring ships. Several transport vessels capsized outright. Others drifted helplessly toward shore, where waves smashed them against rocks and sandbars. Armor dragged soldiers under as they fell into churning black water. Engineers and archers who had survived the beach now drowned in darkness. By dawn, the storm had passed as abruptly as it had arrived. What it left behind was devastation. Dozens of ships damaged. Several destroyed completely. Bodies washing ashore among broken planks. Supplies soaked or lost. Horses drowned. The fleet's cohesion fractured. Onshore, Japanese defenders stared at the wreckage with a growing belief that something greater than strategy was at work. Whispers spread quickly. The divine wind, kamikaze, that moment, it was not yet legend. It was simply relief mixed with awe. The storm had not annihilated the entire fleet, but it had inflicted significant damage and, more importantly, shaken confidence further. Mongol commanders faced a new calculation. Continue a campaign now complicated by weather, supply disruption, rising casualties, and unexpectedly coordinated resistance, or withdraw temporarily, regroup, and return stronger. They chose withdrawal. The fleet pulled back toward Korea. The first invasion of Japan had failed, not because 80 men defeated 20,000 in open battle, but because 80 men had changed how 20,000 thought. The delay at Tsushima, the organized resistance at Hakata, the storm that followed prolonged fighting into dangerous weather conditions. All of it formed a chain reaction that began on a quiet beach where men dressed in white for their own funerals. And this was only the first invasion. 7 years later, the Mongols would return with even greater force, and the legend born at Tsushima would rise again. The Mongols did not forget. Empires like theirs did not accept humiliation quietly, especially not from an island kingdom they had once considered insignificant. The withdrawal after the storm was not viewed as defeat in Karakoram or Khanbaliq. It was classified as delay, adjustment, preparation for overwhelming force. Kublai Khan's response was not hesitation. It was escalation. If 20,000 had failed to break Japan's spirit, then more would come. More ships, more men, more engineers, more artillery. The second invasion would not be a raid. It would be annihilation. And so, over the next several years, shipyards in Korea and China roared day and night. Timber was cut in massive quantities. Black powder stockpiles expanded. Soldiers were conscripted across conquered territories. Mongol cavalry, Chinese infantry, Korean sailors, all funneled into a single objective, Japan. But Japan was no longer the Japan of 1274. Tsushima had changed it. The story of the 80s spread beyond poetry and into policy. Defensive walls were constructed along Hakata Bay, long stone barriers designed specifically to prevent easy beach landings. Coastal watch systems were improved. Clan rivalries softened under the shared understanding that another fleet would come. And perhaps most important of all, the psychological shift endured. The samurai had seen that Mongols could be wounded, could be delayed, could bleed in 1281. The horizon darkened again. This time the fleet was even larger. Estimates vary, but historians place the combined force of the second invasion at over 100,000 men. Thousands of ships stretched across the sea in two converging forces, one from Korea, one from southern China. It was the largest naval invasion attempt the world had ever seen, and waiting on the shores of Kyushu were not scattered bands of warriors, but a nation braced. When the Mongol forces approached Hakata Bay again, they found something very different from the open beaches of Tsushima years earlier. A defensive wall ran along key landing points, forcing attackers into narrow zones. Samurai patrol boats harassed the fleet at night, launching surprise boarding raids under cover of darkness. Instead of standing ceremonially in clear view, Japanese forces adapted fluidly, striking unexpectedly and retreating quickly. The Mongols managed to land in certain areas after heavy fighting. Siege engines were brought ashore. Thunder crash bombs exploded again over Japanese lines. The technological superiority still mattered, and the battles were brutal, chaotic, and costly on both sides. But the invasion did not unfold with smooth inevitability. Japanese forces refused to grant a decisive breakthrough. Small units attacked supply ships. Fires broke out in Mongol camps. Close quarters combat negated some of the long-range advantages the Mongols relied on. And always in the background, the memory of Tsushima lingered like a quiet vow. If necessary, die in a way that cost them everything. Weeks of skirmishes dragged the conflict into late summer. The Mongol fleet, massive and unwieldy, remained anchored offshore while ground forces attempted to consolidate positions. The logistical complexity of maintaining such a force in foreign waters began to strain resources. Weather reports grew increasingly concerning. Typhoon season approached. The Mongol commanders knew the risks, but withdrawing again without decisive victory would damage imperial prestige beyond repair. They held position, and then the sky changed. In August 1281, the wind began to rise, not gradually. Violently, the typhoon descended upon the anchored fleet with devastating force. Ships smashed into one another in darkness. Massive wavoverteurs en transport. Heavy vessels dragged anchors and collided. Thousands of soldiers, unable to swim under the weight of armor, drowned. Timber hulls shattered against rocks and shoreline. The scale of destruction dwarfed the storm of 1274. When the winds finally subsided, the sea was a graveyard. The second invasion had been obliterated to the Japanese. There was no ambiguity in interpretation. The divine wind had returned. Kamikaze. But storms alone do not explain outcomes. The fleet had remained exposed for weeks because ground resistance prevented swift victory. That resistance existed because Japan had unified and fortified. That unification began with shock, and that shock began with 80 men who refused to retreat. From a purely military perspective, Tsushima was annihilation. 100% casualties among defenders. From a strategic perspective, it was ignition. It forced Japan to abandon complacency. It transformed a fragmented feudal society into a coordinated defense network. It proved that Mongols were not invincible and that delay was possible. Modern military theorists study Tsushima not as a victory of force, but as a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Sukekuni did not attempt the impossible task of defeating 20,000 men. He altered the equation. He shifted the battlefield from physical domination to psychological disruption. He ensured the invasion would never feel effortless. And once doubt enters an army, efficiency erodes. When the Mongol Empire evaluated its failures, it faced a reality rare in its history. Some territories cost more than they yielded. Japan, protected by geography, unified by belief, and defended by warriors who embraced death without hesitation, was no longer worth the expenditure. The empire that had conquered from Poland to Korea never successfully invaded Japan. The chain reaction began on a narrow beach where 80 mounted samurai formed a single line and chose visibility over survival. They could not stop the first wave. They could not save their island, but they changed the tempo of history. And sometimes that is enough. After the second invasion fleet was destroyed by the typhoon, the Mongol threat was neutralized, but the story of Tsushima left scars deeper than any wound. Japan had survived, yet the nation was forever changed. The samurai clans, once fractured and consumed with petty rivalries, began to understand the power of unity. Coastal defenses strengthened. Signals and watchtowers expanded along all strategic points. Archery drills increased in intensity. Cavalry training evolved to adapt to massed infantry assaults. Even the armor itself began to change, inspired by lessons from Mongol arrows and bombs. But the victory also cast a shadow. The Mongols would never try a full invasion again, but their appearance had awakened Japan to the reality that isolation alone could not guarantee safety. Japan's leaders now looked outward, studying not only the Mongols but China, Korea, and even distant lands, searching for military innovations and diplomatic strategies. The seeds planted on Tsushima had matured into a cautious, calculating nation preparing for the next wave of threats. It was during this period of quiet vigilance that Japan began to experiment with larger, coordinated armies, a radical departure from centuries of scattered clan skirmishes. Coastal watchposts trained not for ritual display, but for rapid response. Samurai were encouraged to train not only in the katana and bow, but in tactics that considered formations, supply lines, and the psychology of their opponents. The lessons of Tsushima became doctrine. The way of the warrior was no longer purely individual honor. It now included collective survival. Meanwhile, across the sea, whispers of Japan's resilience reached other regions. Pirates and raiders along the coast of Korea and China noticed the Japanese were no longer easy prey. Trade convoys adjusted their routes. Coastal towns invested in fortifications. And in the Mongol Empire itself, generals debated endlessly how a small force of 80 men could cause chaos that toppled timelines, burned morale, and ultimately destroyed ships faster than storms could. But Japan's focus did not remain solely defensive. Inspired by the kamikaze legend in its earliest form, Men who chose death to protect the nation, military thinkers began to consider proactive strikes. The idea was subtle at first. Small, highly mobile units disrupting enemy supply lines, targeting officers, and using speed and surprise over brute force. Tsushima's legacy was becoming more than myth. It was evolving into strategy, and yet, the story was far from over. Over the following decades, internal tensions simmered. The Hojo Regency, strengthened by the Mongol invasions, ruled Japan with unprecedented central authority. Yet distant provinces chafed under increasing control. Samurai trained for foreign invasion now looked at domestic rivals as potential threats. The same discipline and coordination that had saved Japan from conquest now became tools for internal consolidation. That it was during this era, around the late 1300s, that another extraordinary confrontation began to take shape. Not with Mongols, but with a different kind of enemy. Internal insurgencies and foreign traders testing the limits of Japanese defenses. Coastal towns that once cowered before raiders now resisted with the same discipline seen at Tsushima. Commanders who had studied the original 80 samurai began forming units that emphasized psychological impact over brute force, understanding that fear, surprise, and reputation could sometimes achieve what thousands of men could not. And here's where the connection becomes even more fascinating. The legacy of Tsushima inspired a culture of ingenuity that persisted for centuries. Lessons learned from facing a technologically superior invader began to influence how Japanese armies approached any threat, foreign or domestic. By the mid-1400s, when internal conflicts exploded into full-scale civil wars, the principle remained the same. A smaller, disciplined, and strategically aware force could destabilize a larger one. Techniques of feints, targeted strikes, and psychological operations can all be traced back to that single line of 80 men who had chosen death over retreat. Even beyond military campaigns, the legend of Tsushima shaped culture, art, and philosophy. Poets wrote about the courage of the fallen. Monks spoke of sacrifice in temples. Children grew up hearing stories of men who faced impossible odds without fear. And when political leaders considered alliances, strategies, or negotiations, the specter of Tsushima lingered, a reminder that Japanese warriors were not to be underestimated, even when facing overwhelming power. And so, as the 15th century dawned, the country that had once been isolated, fragile, and fractured now looked outward with a mixture of caution and confidence. The Mongols had failed, but their attempt had triggered a chain reaction. Military reform, social cohesion, strategic innovation, and a national identity forged in the crucible of near annihilation. Yet across the waters, rumors persisted. China was rising. Pirates roamed the East China Sea, and European traders were beginning to appear. The stage was set for the next great confrontation, one that would test whether the lessons of Tsushima could survive beyond legend and into actual warfare. The story of 80 men had become a seed that would grow into centuries of strategy, innovation, and indomitable spirit. And history was just beginning to see the ripple effect that by the mid-1400s, the seas around Japan had grown restless. The once clear waters of the East China Sea were now a hunting ground for the Wokou, marauding pirates drawn from Korea, China, and displaced coastal brigands. Unlike the Mongol invasions decades earlier, these were smaller, faster, and more unpredictable foes, relying on surprise, mobility, and sheer audacity rather than overwhelming numbers. Yet the Japanese were no longer the same nation that had faced 80 samurai against 20,000. Lessons from Tsushima and Hakata had been absorbed deeply into military culture. Coastal watchtowers, now built along nearly every vulnerable point, allowed for early detection. Signal fires blinked across cliffs and ridgelines, while small contingents of samurai patrolled beaches, ready to respond with speed and precision. When a Wokou flotilla appeared off the coast near Hakata, the scenario unfolded in a way that would have astonished Mongol commanders. Ships approaching under the cover of darkness were met not with ceremonial charges, but with coordinated volleys of arrows, small boat intercepts, and traps set in tidal channels. Horse-mounted samurai, trained to strike swiftly and then retreat to prepare defensive positions, disrupted landings, causing confusion among the pirate crews. Every tactic had roots in the psychological warfare, first demonstrated by Sukekuni. Just as 80 men had slowed a massive invasion fleet centuries earlier, small units now used the threat of ambush, unexpected counterattacks, and visible defiance to create fear far beyond their numbers. Stories of pirates being ambushed by ghost samurai at night began circulating in Korean and Chinese ports, exaggerations fueled by fear but grounded in truth. Oda Nobunaga emerged as a figure who understood the fusion of innovation, discipline, and psychological impact. He did not rely solely on traditional samurai valor. He embraced firearms, reorganized troops into disciplined units, and orchestrated battles with the precision of a strategist rather than the bravado of an individual warrior. Every volley of arquebus was coordinated to maximize disruption, every cavalry strike timed to exploit enemy confusion. The principles behind Tsushima, turning apparent weakness into tactical advantage, using morale and fear as a force multiplier, were reflected in Nobunaga's campaigns, i.e. the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. For example, Nobunaga's forces faced the Takeda cavalry, renowned for their speed, discipline, and ferocity, reminiscent in many ways of Mongol cavalry decades earlier. Instead of engaging in frontal charges, Nobunaga positioned his arquebusiers behind wooden palisades, staggering volleys to continuously disrupt the attacking cavalry. Samurai fought alongside firearms units, integrating traditional combat with modern technology. The psychological effect was decisive. Takeda forces, accustomed to overwhelming numbers and shock charges, found themselves checked, disrupted, and demoralized. Meanwhile, Toyotomi Hideyoshi would later apply similar principles during his unification campaigns. Coastal raids, river crossings, and sieges were conducted with careful observation, intelligence, and timing. Fortifications learned from the defensive expansions after Tsushima were refined into sophisticated castles capable of withstanding long sieges and concentrated artillery fire. Siege strategies integrated both terror and tactical precision. Misinformation, feigned retreats, and targeted strikes amplified the effect of each engagement. Even individual warriors absorbed the ethos of Tsushima. The idea that a disciplined, courageous force could inflict disproportionate effects on a superior opponent became central to samurai culture. Death was still honorable, but increasingly survival and tactical impact were equally celebrated. The rituals of old, death poems, personal valor, now existed alongside the calculated use of terrain, timing, and technology. Psychological warfare was not just a legend. It was doctrine. Trade and foreign influence continued to introduce new tools. Portuguese firearms were refined, Dutch cannons would later be adapted, and European ships influenced naval designs. Japanese commanders integrated these technologies with their traditional strategies, creating hybrid forces capable of meeting threats both from within and abroad. Every innovation was filtered through a lens of historical experience, the lessons of Tsushima acting as a guiding principle. Understand your enemy, use the environment, and leverage morale and perception as much as physical strength. By the late 16th century, Japan was no longer a fragmented island of isolated clans. The unification campaigns of Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and eventually Tokugawa Ieyasu were built on a foundation that began with 80 men on a windswept beach centuries earlier. Small, disciplined units could create outsized impact. Psychological dominance could neutralize numerical or technological superiority. And strategic sacrifice, when done with foresight, could alter the trajectory of an entire nation. As Japan consolidated under the Tokugawa shogunate, the lessons persisted. Coastal defenses remained vigilant. Firearms integrated into garrison drills, and the ethos of measured, purposeful sacrifice became embedded in both military doctrine and cultural identity. Tsushima's 80 men had long vanished into history, but their philosophy endured shaping tactics, training, and the mindset of a nation that had learned to survive against overwhelming odds. The story of Japan had evolved, from 80 samurai against 20,000 Mongols, to coastal defenses against pirates, to the large-scale unification wars of the Sengoku period, and finally into a stable, disciplined society capable of resisting both foreign invasion and internal chaos. The thread connecting all of these events was clear. Courage, discipline, adaptation, and strategic thinking could defy overwhelming odds and turn potential defeat into lasting advantage. And yet, the world beyond Japan was changing even faster. European empires were expanding their reach. Chinese dynasties were consolidating power, and new naval technologies promised to challenge even the most fortified coasts. Japan's warriors, inspired by Tsushima, but facing entirely new threats, would soon confront challenges unlike any in their history. Challenges that would test whether the lessons of sacrifice, discipline, and psychological strategy could survive in an age of gunpowder, ships, and global ambition. To be why the mid-16th century, Japan's coasts were no longer just battlefields for pirates or Mongol echoes. They became ports of encounter with Europeans, Portuguese traders arriving with exotic goods, Christian missionaries, and weapons that would redefine warfare. The arrival of matchlock firearms, cannons, and even naval strategies introduced a new kind of uncertainty, a challenge that required more than courage or tradition. Yet Japan was not unprepared. The memory of Tsushima had evolved into a philosophy: observe, adapt, and exploit both enemy psychology and environmental advantage. Samurai units now trained alongside arquebusiers, learning to coordinate volleys of gunfire with sword and spear. Coastal forts were upgraded to resist cannon fire, using angled walls, elevated platforms, and traps that forced attackers into predictable zones. Signal fires and watchtowers, once designed for Mongols or pirates, now served as early warning systems for European ships, giving defenders precious hours to organize. The Namban trade brought not only weapons but knowledge. Japanese leaders observed European shipbuilding, navigation, and tactics, adapting the best ideas to their own strategy. Samurai commanders studied the timing of cannon volleys, the reload rate of firearms, and the vulnerabilities of foreign armor and ships. Every engagement, whether a coastal skirmish or a formal negotiation, was an opportunity to convert unfamiliar technology into a tactical advantage. The psychological lessons of Tsushima were applied with precision. When European ships attempted coastal harassment or trade intimidation, Japanese forces staged visible drills, coordinated coastal signals, and arranged troops to appear larger and more disciplined than reality. Even without engaging directly, they communicated strength, unity, and readiness, deterring rash attacks and reinforcing Japan's reputation as a nation that would defend itself at any cost. Meanwhile, samurai adapted personally. Matchlocks were integrated into personal arsenals, drilled in coordination with cavalry charges, archery volleys, and infantry formations. Firearms did not replace swords, but complemented them, allowing small units to punch above their weight. Samurai, who had once trained solely for ritualized combat, now became hybrid warriors, lethal, adaptable, and capable of merging centuries-old discipline with the shock of new technology. Diplomacy, too, became a battlefield. Tsushima's lesson had taught that sometimes the most powerful weapon is perception. European traders and missionaries quickly learned that Japan's leaders were cautious, calculating, and willing to sacrifice if necessary. Letters, envoys, and trade agreements were carefully calibrated to test Japanese resolve without provoking conflict, while spies and scouts monitored foreign intentions. The combination of strategic intelligence, psychological signaling, and technological adaptation kept Japan several steps ahead of potential threats. To be why the late 16th century, Japan had transformed once again. The coastal defenses, disciplined samurai, and integrated firearms had created a nation capable of repelling foreign raids, influencing trade negotiations, and turning the introduction of new technology into a competitive advantage. The core lesson was clear: Courage and sacrifice were powerful, but knowledge, adaptation, and psychological impact multiplied that power exponentially. Even the cultural narrative reinforced this philosophy. Stories of Tsushima, Woka defenses, and early European encounters were taught in villages and schools, reminding every samurai that a single action, a single unit, or even 80 determined men could shape the fate of millions. Poetry, oral history, and calligraphy celebrated both valor and strategy, ensuring that the principles behind survival were understood as much as the acts themselves. And yet, the horizon remained uncertain. European ambitions grew, rival Chinese dynasties expanded, and internal power struggle simmered. Japan had learned to fight, adapt, and intimidate, but the next century would test whether these lessons could withstand the full force of globalization, advanced weaponry, and new ideologies. The spirit of Tsushima, the courage to face impossible odds, the use of strategic sacrifice, and a mastery of psychological warfare, will become more crucial than ever by the closing decades of the 16th century. Japan was a nation on the brink of both chaos and consolidation. Centuries of isolation, foreign threats, and internal strife had created a crucible in which the samurai evolved into a force both disciplined and adaptive. Yet the land remained fractured. Dozens of ambitious warlords, each with armies loyal only to their banners, vied for power across mountains, plains, and coastlines. It was a time when strategy and psychology were just as vital as courage, and the lessons of Tsushima echoed louder than ever. Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man whose name would become synonymous with stability and order, understood this better than most. Born into a world shaped by Mongol invasions, pirate raids, and European trade, he carried in his mind the strategies of the past. The stories of 80 men on Tsushima who turned certain death into tactical genius were not mere legends but templates for thinking. Ieyasu knew that victory often came not from sheer numbers, but from preparation, deception, and the ability to manipulate both terrain and morale. The path to unification was neither swift nor easy. Provinces were fiercely independent, samurai bound to their lords by loyalty rather than any sense of national identity. Battles were not simple confrontations. They were psychological contests, tests of discipline, and demonstrations of both honor and ingenuity. The memory of Tsushima had instilled one fundamental truth in every Japanese commander. A smaller, disciplined, and well-led force could bend the course of events far beyond what numbers might suggest. That Ieyasu's strategy combined patience, intelligence gathering, and precise timing. He maintained careful alliances, studied the strengths and weaknesses of rival clans, and trained his samurai not only in traditional swordsmanship, but in firearms, formation tactics, and siege warfare. He understood the psychological element of warfare, projecting strength even when outnumbered, using visible readiness to intimidate, and choosing battles where victory could be maximized while risk minimized. The culmination of Ieyasu's rise came at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, one of the largest and most consequential battles in Japanese history. Tens of thousands of samurai faced each other across fog-shrouded fields. It was a stage where every lesson learned over centuries, from the wind-swept beaches of Tsushima to coastal raids against pirates, from encounters with Portuguese firearms to inland clan skirmishes, was applied with deadly precision at Sekigahara. Ieyasu positioned his forces strategically, using natural terrain, calculated troop placements, and prearranged contingencies. Some units were deliberately positioned to lure enemy forces into traps. Others held their ground as psychological anchors, maintaining a steady presence that signaled confidence to allies and sapped courage from opponents. In real time, messages were sent, scouts moved covertly, and reinforcements were timed to exploit enemy hesitation. Every move carried the echoes of centuries of warfare philosophy, discipline, adaptation, and the deliberate use of perception to influence outcomes. When the battle erupted, it was chaos made controlled. Gunfire cracked across the hills, cavalry thundered across open fields, and spearmen clashed in tightly coordinated formations. Samurai charges, though deadly, were carefully timed to coincide with supporting volleys from firearms, ensuring maximum disruption. Each engagement was as much about breaking morale as breaking lines. The battlefield became a theater in which psychology, timing, and terrain were weapons as lethal as katanas or arrows. The genius of Ieyasu's command lay in patience and precision. He did not rush. He waited for enemy weaknesses to reveal themselves. He exploited divisions within opposing factions, encouraging defections at critical moments. And when the tipping point arrived, he struck decisively. Within hours, what could have been a prolonged, bloody stalemate became a complete collapse of enemy cohesion. Tokugawa's victory was absolute, but it was also a testament to centuries of learned strategy, a direct line tracing back to the courage, discipline, and tactical foresight displayed by Sukekuni and his 80 samurai on that distant November morning in 1274. Sekigahara did more than unify Japan. It transformed the nation. Tokugawa Ieyasu established a shogunate that would endure for over 2.5 centuries, creating centralized governance, strict social order, and a military system that integrated the lessons of both old and new. Coastal defenses remained vigilant. Castles became sophisticated fortresses, and the samurai retained not only honor, but a role in maintaining discipline, intelligence, and readiness throughout the land. The cultural implications were equally profound. Tales of Tsushima and other legendary battles were embedded in schools, temples, and village lore, instilling a sense of shared history, unity, and purpose. Strategic sacrifice, the psychological manipulation of the enemy, and the effective use of technological innovation became guiding principles, taught alongside swordsmanship and archery. Every samurai knew that a single action, executed with precision and courage, could ripple through history, affecting outcomes far beyond the immediate battlefield. And yet, the world outside Japan continued to evolve. European empires expanded their maritime reach, gunpowder technologies advanced, and trade networks grew increasingly complex. Japan's isolationist tendencies, which would later define the Tokugawa era, were informed by centuries of experience. Lessons of coastal defense, of facing overwhelming forces, and of using discipline and perception to multiply strength. The nation was prepared, not by chance, but by the legacy of calculated courage, strategic sacrifice, and adaptive innovation. The story of 80 men on a windswept beach who had once faced 20,000 Mongols had now transcended legend. It had become a framework for understanding warfare, leadership, and even governance. It had influenced generations of samurai, shaped the outcomes of massive battles like Sekigahara, and guided the creation of a unified, disciplined Japan capable of controlling its destiny for centuries. And as Tokugawa Ieyasu surveyed the newly unified nation, he carried within him the echoes of that November morning in 1274. The understanding that courage alone was insufficient, that preparation, adaptation, and strategic foresight could turn even the smallest, most desperate force into a decisive one, and that the spirit of sacrifice, when combined with intelligence, could alter the course of history itself. With Tokugawa Ieyasu's victory at Sekigahara and the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603, Japan entered an era unlike any it had experienced before. Centuries of chaos, constant warfare, an external threat gave way to an unprecedented level of centralized control. The land that had once been a mosaic of competing clans now moved under a single disciplined hand. But the lessons of Tsushima and Sengoku chaos were never forgotten. The shogunate understood that stability was not merely about ruling through law or sword. It was about maintaining vigilance, preparing for threats, and ensuring the samurai retained their skills, honor, and purpose. The samurai, whose numbers had been drastically reduced after decades of war, were transformed from battlefield mercenaries into the enforcers of order, the eyes of the shogun, and a living embodiment of martial culture. Their training remained rigorous. but it now included not only swordsmanship and archery, but also the principles of observation, discipline, and strategic calculation. The ethos of Tsushima, courage combined with calculated action, became a guiding principle. Every samurai, even when not on a battlefield, was to understand the importance of duty, foresight, and psychological mastery. Castles, the new centers of power, reflected this philosophy. Fortresses such as Edo Castle were not simply defensive structures. They were instruments of both deterrence and demonstration. Walls, moats, watchtowers, and signaling systems were designed not only to repel attackers, but also to project strength, to send a message that Japan's rulers were vigilant, organized, and impossible to surprise. Coastal defenses, too, remained active, a subtle reminder of the Mongol invasion centuries earlier. Lookouts scanned the horizon, drills maintained discipline, and even isolated islands were patrolled with the knowledge that foreign forces could return at any moment. The shogunate's control extended beyond pure military might. By regulating the daimyo, enforcing strict social hierarchies, and monitoring movement across the land, Tokugawa ensured that potential unrest could be identified and neutralized before it became a threat. Samurai became administrators as well as warriors. Their martial training married with meticulous record-keeping, intelligence gathering, and enforcement of order. In every aspect, the principles that Sukekuni had applied on that fateful November beach, observation, preparation, psychological awareness, were mirrored in peacetime governance. Yet, this was not a time of stagnation. Military culture remained alive, practiced, and celebrated. Martial exercises, drills, and tournaments were held regularly, blending ceremony with practical training. Samurai engaged in coordinated infantry formations, cavalry exercises, and archery competitions designed to simulate real battle conditions. Even in times of peace, they were taught to think tactically, to anticipate the enemy, and to act with discipline under pressure. The memory of Tsushima's 80 men who had changed history through courage, planning, and ritual sacrifice serve as a constant reminder. A disciplined, focused, and prepared force could outmatch superior numbers. The shogunate also maintained strategic control over foreign influence. Trade and diplomacy were carefully monitored, and contact with outsiders was limited to specific control ports. The lessons of the Nanban period, the dangers and opportunities of foreign firearms, ships, and tactics were never forgotten. Japan would adopt what was useful, master it, and prevent outside forces from gaining any advantage over the internal balance of power. Even seemingly minor coastal islands were fortified, patrolled, and integrated into a system of early warning that echoed the observation posts of Tsushima centuries earlier. Culturally, the legacy of these battles and lessons became deeply embedded. Stories of heroic sacrifice, strategic genius, and disciplined courage were recorded in chronicles, taught in temples, and celebrated in poetry and theater. Villagers recounted tales of samurai who faced impossible odds, not for personal glory, but to protect their homeland, their honor, and their people. These narratives reinforced the central idea that survival and dominance were achieved not only through strength, but through foresight, unity, and deliberate, calculated action. That'd be why the mid-17th century, Japan had achieved a stability unseen in its history. Its borders were secure, its people disciplined, and its samurai capable of defending both the nation and the shogunate's authority. The lessons of Tsushima had transformed from battlefield tactics into an entire cultural framework. Sacrifice for purpose, courage tempered with calculation, and the use of psychological influence to shape events. Japan's unity was not accidental. It was the product of centuries of learning, adaptation, and the deliberate cultivation of both skill and morale. Even as the seas beyond Japan shifted and neighboring powers grew, the islands themselves remained resolute. Coastal lookouts, patrols, and fortifications ensured that any threat, whether pirate, foreign fleet, or internal rebellion, would be met with preparation, discipline, and the kind of courage that could turn overwhelming odds into a manageable, even victorious situation. In every fortress, on every beach, And in every samurai's training, the memory of those 80 men lived on. A reminder that sometimes the smallest, most disciplined force could shape the fate of an entire nation. That'd be why the early 17th century, Japan under Tokugawa rule, was a nation transformed. The unification wars were over, the chaos of the Sengoku period had ended, and the samurai, once roaming warriors of personal honor, had become the backbone of an organized, disciplined society. But the essence of their martial identity, the principles that had defined Tsushima, Sekigahara, and coastal defense, was not lost. In fact, it was institutionalized, embedded into daily life, training, and governance across every domain of the archipelago. Castles were not just fortresses, they were symbols of power, discipline, and readiness. Edo Castle, the seat of the shogunate, stood as the pinnacle of architectural and strategic planning. Its walls were thick and sloped to deflect artillery fire, moats deep and wide enough to stall any assault, gates designed to force attackers into narrow kill zones, and watchtowers positioned to maintain surveillance over the surrounding city. Even minor castles in distant provinces reflected similar principles, ensuring that every domain was prepared for both rebellion and external attack. The memory of the Mongol invasions and Tsushima's beaches echoed in every stone and moat. Visibility, preparation, and psychological projection were as important as physical defenses. The samurai themselves underwent a transformation in routine and mindset. Daily drills combined swordsmanship, spear work, archery, and firearms practice. Cavalry maneuvers were conducted not only for battlefield efficiency, but for ritual discipline, ensuring that even ceremonial displays of martial skill could serve a strategic purpose. Matchlock firearms, once a novelty brought by Portuguese traders, were carefully integrated into formations, with units trained to coordinate volleys in precise timing. Archery remained central, not merely as tradition, but as a tool for developing focus, discipline, and the understanding of distance, angles, and timing. Lessons that had once helped 80 men slow an unstoppable Mongol advance. Coastal defense remained a priority. Small islands and hidden inlets, once vulnerable to Woko pirates and foreign raiders, were now meticulously monitored. Watchtowers and signal fires dotted the coastline, trained observers scanning for any sign of intrusion. Patrol boats moved regularly, practicing coordinated responses that combined speed, firepower, and terrain advantage. Even in peacetime, the samurai understood that vigilance was a weapon, and that perception alone could dissuade potential attackers. A lesson learned from centuries of facing overwhelming odds, beyond military readiness. Tokugawa rule emphasized intelligence, psychological awareness, and strategic foresight. Samurai served as local administrators, gathering information, monitoring dissent, and ensuring that any rebellion could be detected before it escalated. The philosophy of Tsushima, understanding your enemy, using terrain and perception as force multipliers and turning apparent weakness into advantage, was applied to governance itself. Orders were clear, obedience was expected, and every action, from village inspections to ceremonial duties, reinforced discipline and cohesion. Culturally, the era saw the codification of samurai values. Literature, theater, and poetry celebrated not only personal bravery, but strategic thinking, loyalty, and the disciplined application of force. Ballads recounted the sacrifice of Tsushima's 80 warriors, while scrolls and illustrated guides taught techniques, formations, and tactics. Samurai were not merely warriors. They were living embodiments of centuries of lessons, balancing martial prowess with intellect, observation, and psychological acumen. The ideal warrior could calculate, anticipate, and act decisively, living the ethos that one well-placed action could influence the fate of thousands. Even ordinary citizens became part of this system of disciplined readiness. Villages maintained evacuation protocols in case of coastal raids. Signaling practices were taught to fishermen and farmers, and local militias were trained to provide early warnings or support castle garrisons. The nation's entire infrastructure, from remote islands to major cities, reflected a mindset forged over centuries of facing overwhelming threats. Tsushima's beach, once the site of near-certain death for 80 men, had become a metaphorical blueprint for preparedness. Knowledge, observation, discipline, and courage multiplied across every layer of society. By mid-Tokugawa, Japan was both a fortress and a society steeped in strategy. Ritualized drills, surveillance, and intelligence work ensured that any internal or external threat would be met with rapid, coordinated, and psychologically intimidating responses. Samurai retained their ceremonial elegance while practicing tactical precision. Firearms were integrated without sacrificing the artistry of traditional combat. And in every action, from patrolling rivers to organizing castle defenses, the principles of strategic sacrifice, psychological projection, and disciplined courage were alive and unbroken. The story of Japan's transformation illustrates a remarkable continuity. From the 80 men of Tsushima who faced 20,000 Mongols, to coastal defenses against pirates, to Sekigahara's massive unification battles, to Tokugawa-era administration and readiness, the same threads ran through every generation. Courage, observation, disciplined action, and the understanding that the psychological impact of a well-timed decision could equal or exceed physical strength. Japan had learned not merely to survive, but to convert every challenge, internal or external, into an opportunity to demonstrate control, resilience, and strategic brilliance. And yet, even within this era of stability, the samurai lived with the constant awareness that history could shift in an instant. Coastal raiders, internal unrest, and the distant presence of foreign powers were always reminders that vigilance, discipline, and strategy were not optional. They were essential. The legacy of Tsushima was no longer a story of 80 men dying on a beach. It was a living framework, a philosophy that guided the training, governance, and culture of an entire nation. By the mid-17th century, Tokugawa Japan had matured into a society where discipline, observation, and preparation were inseparable from daily life. The samurai, once primarily battlefield warriors, had become the guardians of both martial excellence and social order. Their training was no longer episodic or ceremonial alone. It was constant, deliberate, and integrated into every aspect of governance. Swordsmanship, archery, and spear drills were synchronized with matchlock firearm exercises, cavalry maneuvers, and psychological conditioning. Every warrior understood that their presence alone could project power, and that each action, from inspection to ceremony, carried strategic weight. The castle networks established across the archipelago were masterpieces of both architecture and strategy. Edo Castle in the shogun's capital was the model, but even smaller fortresses were meticulously engineered. Walls were angled to deflect projectiles, moats were deep and irregular to disrupt attackers, and gates were designed to create choke points. Observation towers were positioned not only to scan for approaching armies, but to control the movement of civilians and relay signals rapidly across distances. From these vantage points, a single observer could coordinate an entire regional defense. Much like the watchmen of Tsushima had once counted approaching Mongol ships, translating observation into decisive action. Coastal defenses became a discipline in their own right. Small islands and hidden inlets, once vulnerable to pirates or foreign fleets, were systematically monitored. Samurai patrols moved silently across beaches and cliffs, trained to respond immediately to sightings of sails on the horizon. Signal fires and messenger relays ensured that any potential invasion could be reported and countered within hours. Even when no enemy appeared, drills were constant, simulating landings, coordinated counterattacks, and defensive formations. The psychological principle was the same one Sukekuni had understood centuries earlier. The display of readiness could deter attack, even without a fight, and prepare the defenders to multiply their effectiveness if the enemy pressed forward. The samurai code, Bushido, reached a refined state in this era. Loyalty, honor, and courage remained central, but the code now emphasized strategic thinking and adaptability. Ritualized combat training included scenarios designed to test observation, timing, and psychological awareness. Samurai were taught to anticipate enemy actions, to exploit terrain, and to understand the broader implications of every maneuver. The lessons of Tsushima, that courage alone could not win, but courage combined with discipline, timing, and psychological impact could turn the tide, were integrated into every curriculum, from archery dojos to mounted cavalry exercises. Education and cultural reinforcement further strengthened this martial philosophy. Chronicles and illustrated scrolls recorded not just victories, but tactics, formations, and even enemy behaviors. Villagers, peasants, and local administrators were instructed in basic signaling, evacuation procedures, and how to support samurai contingents. The memory of Tsushima became more than legend. It was a teaching tool. Every coastal village, mountain pass, and castle garrison embodied the principle that even small, disciplined forces could multiply their effect against a larger enemy. Internal governance mirrored this approach. Samurai served as magistrates, tax collectors, and intelligence agents, ensuring that the shogunate's reach extended into every corner of the nation. Observation, preparation, and rapid response were institutionalized. Reports were gathered continuously, drills were conducted regularly, and local lords were required to maintain readiness. This created a culture in which the population was disciplined. The samurai were perpetually skilled, and the nation could respond to threats with coordinated speed and efficiency. Even ceremonial practices carried strategic value. Processions, archery displays, and mounted demonstrations were performed with precision, reinforcing discipline while projecting strength. Foreign visitors, traders, or envoys witnessed not only Japan's cultural sophistication, but also its readiness, its cohesion, and its implicit warning. Any attempt to seize or subvert Japanese land would encounter both preparation and unyielding courage. The psychological lessons of Tsushima were alive in every performance, every drill, every gesture of samurai presence. By the late 17th century, Tokugawa Japan had achieved a remarkable synthesis. A peaceful nation, yet one whose martial capacity, observation networks, and psychological readiness remained unmatched. Coastal patrols, castle garrisons, and samurai drills ensured that even in the absence of immediate conflict, the country could mobilize rapidly and project strength far beyond its size. The principle was simple. Readiness, discipline, and psychological projection multiplied the effectiveness of every individual. Just as 80 men on a windswept beach had once turned certain death into strategic advantage. Cultural memory reinforced this system. Ballads, poems, and teaching scrolls reminded every generation of samurai and citizens alike that the strength of Japan lay not merely in numbers, but in cohesion, preparation, and the disciplined execution of duty. Legends of Tsushima, Sekihara, and coastal skirmishes were integrated into both education and ritual, ensuring that courage without planning was never romanticized alone. Only courage combined with foresight and discipline would endure. In essence, Japan had created a society where strategy was inseparable from culture, readiness was inseparable from honor, and discipline amplified courage. Every coastal tower, castle gate, and samurai regiment was a living testament to the centuries-long evolution of martial philosophy. The actions of a handful of men centuries earlier had been transformed into the guiding principles of an entire nation. The psychological and strategic genius of Tsushima was no longer a single event. It had become the DNA of Japanese governance, military culture, and social cohesion, preparing the islands to survive challenges both internal and external for generations to come. As the Tokugawa era progressed, the samurai's role evolved into a blend of martial excellence, administrative responsibility, and psychological mastery. The training of a samurai became a lifelong pursuit, combining physical skill with mental acuity. Daily drills began at dawn and continued until dusk, incorporating swordsmanship, spear fighting, mounted archery, and firearm coordination. Even matchlock firearms, introduced by foreign traders decades earlier, were no longer curiosities but integrated into disciplined formations. Samurai practiced synchronized volleys, learned to anticipate enemy movement, and trained to exploit terrain to maximize their effectiveness. Each drill, each exercise was a rehearsal not only for combat, but for projecting power and control, turning presence into psychological dominance. Castle networks reached their peak sophistication during this period. Every domain, from the largest cities to remote mountain outposts, contained fortifications designed for layered defense and observation. Edo Castle stood as the centerpiece. Walls thick and angled, moats deep and irregular, gates forcing attackers into narrow kill zones. Watchtowers overlooked both city streets and distant hills, allowing observers to signal reinforcements at a moment's notice. But the same principles applied to smaller castles. Even minor fortresses were designed with the psychology of intimidation in mind. Imposing walls, carefully aligned gates, and visible patrols ensured that any approaching force felt both the weight and precision of Japanese preparedness before even engaging. The lessons of Tsushima, that perception, organization, and ritualized action could amplify the smallest force, had become central to architecture itself. Coastal defenses were equally meticulous. Islands that had once been vulnerable to pirates, foreign fleets, or the remnants of Woku raiders were now patrolled regularly. Lookouts were stationed to scan the horizon for sails, trained to differentiate between fishing boats and potential invaders. Signal fires, drum beats, and messenger systems connected distant towers, allowing rapid communication across tens of miles of coastline. Samurai patrols practiced coordinated responses to landings, simulating assaults, scouting enemy formations, and orchestrating counterattacks. Every village and port was integrated into this network, creating a living defensive organism where knowledge, discipline, and rapid reaction multiplied the effectiveness of each individual samurai. Even intelligence gathering became a science. Samurai and administrators monitored both internal and external movements, cataloging information about potential threats, rival lords, and even foreign traders. Observation was constant, and reports flowed through a hierarchical system designed for rapid dissemination. The lessons of Tsushima were evident. Knowing the enemy, predicting movements, and controlling perception could compensate for numerical or technological disadvantages. Samurai acted as both warriors and intelligence officers, their disciplined vigilance ensuring that any threat could be met with foresight and precision. Cultural reinforcement of these principles was pervasive. Chronicles and illustrated scrolls detailed not only historical battles, but also tactical insights, formation patterns, and psychological techniques. Drama, poetry, and martial exercises all carried underlying lessons in observation, timing, and strategic sacrifice. The ethos of Tsushima, courage intertwined with calculation, ritualized action magnified by psychological effect, became a template for behavior both on and off the battlefield. Villagers learned to respect the samurai not only as enforcers of law, but as living embodiments of strategy, discipline, and unwavering focus. Even ceremonial displays served practical purposes. Mounted processions, archery competitions, and coordinated formations demonstrated the ability to act decisively and cohesively. Foreign traders and envoys witnessed these displays and understood that Japan was a nation where readiness and cohesion were not optional, but ingrained into every aspect of life. The samurai's presence alone projected both authority and preparedness, a living warning that any breach of the shogunate's order would encounter disciplined, coordinated resistance. That be why the late Tokugawa period, Japan had created a society where martial philosophy, social order, and national security were inseparable. Coastal patrols, castle garrisons, and intelligence networks ensured rapid response to any threat, while cultural practices and rituals reinforced discipline and readiness. The memory of Tsushima was no longer just a legend of 80 men facing overwhelming odds. It had become the blueprint for national survival. Every samurai understood that courage without discipline was hollow, that presence without preparation was meaningless, and that psychological projection could multiply the effect of even the smallest force. This meticulous preparation and integration of martial, administrative, and psychological principles created a Japan that was both peaceful and perpetually ready. Coastal raids were intercepted before they could land. Internal unrest was detected before it could escalate, and samurai forces could be mobilized with precision across vast distances. Every tower, patrol, and castle became a node in a system designed to amplify the power of disciplined action, turning centuries of accumulated lessons into an unbroken chain of readiness, foresight, and deterrence. In essence, by the close of the 17th century, Japan had internalized the genius of Tsushima. It was no longer a single battle, no longer the tale of 80 men against 20,000. It had become a philosophy, a cultural and military doctrine that guided governance, defense, and societal cohesion. The principle was simple. The smallest, most disciplined, and strategically aware force could shape the fate of a nation, and preparation, observation, and psychological mastery could multiply the power of every individual. Every castle, every patrol, every drill was a testament to centuries of applied wisdom, ensuring that Japan could endure and resist whatever challenges the world might present. By the mid-18th century, Japan's samurai had become more than warriors. They were the living embodiment of an entire nation's discipline, culture, and foresight. Every domain, every castle, and every coastal outpost functioned like a node in a vast, interconnected network of martial and civic preparedness. Samurai academies, once small and focused solely on swordsmanship or archery, had evolved into institutions of rigorous, multifaceted training. Young men learned not only the art of the blade, but also tactics, formations, reconnaissance, observation, and the careful orchestration of forces. Lessons passed down from battles long before their time. With Tsushima's 80 men, now the foundational myth of strategic sacrifice and psychological influence. At these academies, students began their day before sunrise, running drills across castle courtyards, practicing mounted maneuvers on uneven terrain, and coordinating archery volleys with small firearm units. Training was never idle. Every action had a purpose, every exercise a lesson. Discipline was enforced not only through repetition, but through ritual, instilling both obedience and foresight. Even the smallest detail, the polish of a sword, the alignment of armor, the placement of a foot in formation, was tied to the understanding that a single moment in battle could determine the outcome for dozens, hundreds, or even thousands. Samurai learned to measure timing, distance, and positioning with precision, and they internalized the knowledge that courage without calculation was meaningless. Castles themselves had become living classrooms. Edo Castle and its smaller counterparts were equipped with training grounds, observation towers, signal systems, and mock battlegrounds. Students could simulate enemy landings, practice coordinating counterattacks, and test communication systems using drums, flags, and smoke signals. Even the natural terrain surrounding castles was studied and incorporated into exercises. Hills, rivers, marshes, and forests were all used to train samurai to adapt their strategies, turning the landscape into both weapon and ally. These practices reinforced the fundamental principle learned at Tsushima. Knowledge of terrain, preparation, and observation could multiply a force's effectiveness beyond its numerical strength. Coastal defenses became more sophisticated with each passing decade. Islands, inlets, and hidden coves that had once offered safe havens to pirates now became training grounds and early warning posts. Observation towers dotted the coastline, each connected to neighboring posts through a web of signals, fires, flags, and drums. Samurai patrolled the beaches and cliffs, learning not only to spot approaching vessels, but to interpret their size, formation, and potential intent. Drills were conducted to simulate both landings and retreats, teaching quick adaptation and coordination. Even ordinary villagers participated, learning evacuation routes, signaling techniques, and the principles of supporting defending forces. The memory of Tsushima's beach, where 80 men had delayed a vastly superior enemy, became a guiding doctrine. Small forces, disciplined and aware, could shape the actions of a far larger foe. Intelligence gathering, already a crucial component of Tokugawa governance, became increasingly systematic. Samurai acting as magistrates and administrators monitored both internal and external developments. Reports on the movement of foreign ships, local unrest, and natural conditions were carefully compiled and transmitted up the chain of command. Every observation, no matter how small, was analyzed and incorporated into planning. The ethos of Tsushima, that insight and foresight could turn inevitable defeat into strategic advantage, was alive in every corner of the shogunate. Samurai understood that knowing the enemy, anticipating movements, and preparing psychologically for combat could often determine the outcome long before swords were drawn. Cultural reinforcement of these principles ensured their survival across generations. Chronicles, illustrated scrolls, and oral traditions celebrated both the martial skill and strategic genius of past heroes. Tsushima was told not merely as a tale of courage, but as a template for thinking, observing, and acting decisively under pressure. Theater and poetry highlighted the interplay of honor, discipline, and psychological mastery. Villagers and citizens internalized the lessons. Courage alone was insufficient. Preparation, awareness, and purposeful action were the true measure of strength. Samurai, scholars, and commoners alike understood that the survival and unity of the nation depended on both individual skill and collective coordination. Even ceremonial displays, while ornate and traditional, were infused with practical lessons. Mounted processions, archery demonstrations, and synchronized formations served dual purposes. They showcased discipline and projected psychological power. Foreign traders or envoys witnessing these displays could see that Japan was a nation of vigilance, preparation, and cohesion. The effect was subtle but profound. Even the perception of readiness amplified the nation's strength, deterring potential aggressors without a single blow struck, by the late 18th century. The cumulative effect of centuries of preparation was clear. Samurai, castles, coastal patrols, and intelligence networks had created a society in which readiness, discipline, and psychological influence were woven into daily life. Every action reinforced strategic awareness. Every ritual, every training session, every patrol acted as a multiplier for Japan's defensive power. The memory of Tsushima, once the story of 80 men on a windswept beach, had become the framework for national survival, instilling a philosophy that courage alone could not defend a nation, but courage paired with discipline, foresight, and calculated action could. Japan had become a nation where the smallest, most disciplined force could influence the fate of thousands. Every samurai, every castle guard, every observer on a remote island internalized the principle that preparation, observation, and psychological mastery were as lethal as swords and arrows. Tsushima was no longer merely history. It was doctrine, a living guide for centuries of martial and social cohesion, ensuring that the nation would endure, resist, and remain unified in the face of any challenge that might come from across the seas. As the Tokugawa era approached its final century, Japan stood as a nation shaped and hardened by centuries of preparation, vigilance, and disciplined courage. The 80 men of Tsushima were no longer just a tale of sacrifice. They were a blueprint, a guiding principle embedded in the hearts of every samurai, every castle garrison, and every coastal lookout. From the windswept beaches where foreign raiders might attempt a landing, to the highest towers of Edo Castle, the lessons of strategic foresight, disciplined readiness, and psychological impact were visible in every corner of the archipelago. Even in peace, the samurai maintained the mindset that had saved their nation centuries earlier. Training never ceased. Drills grew increasingly sophisticated, combining mounted archery, spear formations, and matchlock firearms in intricate simulations of invasion scenarios. Observation and intelligence gathering were constant. Coastal watchtowers scanned the horizon day and night, signal fires and flags, transmitting warnings with precision. Villagers were trained in evacuation procedures and signaling, turning the entire population into a layer of early warning that multiplied the effectiveness of the disciplined warriors stationed nearby. Tsushima's lesson had been internalized. Readiness, coordination, and the projection of presence could amplify even the smallest force into an impenetrable deterrent. The samurai's cultural identity evolved alongside their military skill. Poetry, calligraphy, and ritualized combat reinforced the discipline required to act decisively under pressure. Ballads and illustrated scrolls told the story of Tsushima not merely as a tragedy, but as a strategic triumph. Every child born in Japan was raised in the shadow of those 80 men, learning that honor alone was not enough. Preparation, discipline, and calculated action were the true measure of courage. This ethos permeated every aspect of society. In the administration of villages, the governance of domains, and the ceremonial life of castles, the legacy of Tsushima remained present, guiding choices and instilling unity. Even the most remote island was connected to this philosophy. Coastal defenses were no longer isolated outposts. They were nodes in a vast, integrated system. Patrols, observation towers, and signal networks ensured that any threat could be detected early, assessed accurately, and met with coordinated response. Samurai were trained to use the terrain as weapon and shield, understanding that psychological impact could equal or surpass the effect of weapons. Just as 80 men on a single beach had slowed an unstoppable force, so too could disciplined coordination turn potential defeat into strategic advantage across the nation. And yet, the ultimate triumph of this system was not in battles fought, but in deterrence achieved. Japan remained largely uninvaded during Tokugawa rule. Every coastal patrol, every castle guard, every carefully coordinated drill projected power, instilled caution in potential aggressors, and reinforced the message that Japan's warriors were not only skilled in combat, but disciplined, coordinated, and unwavering in resolve. The ripple effect of Tsushima was evident. A nation once vulnerable to overwhelming external forces had become a fortress of strategy, foresight, and psychological mastery. When historians later looked back on the saga, they saw more than military skill. They saw a civilization that had learned to survive and thrive against overwhelming odds. The 80 men who had died on Tsushima were no longer just a statistic of courage against impossible numbers. They were the seed of a philosophy that shaped an entire society. Their sacrifice had become doctrine, their deaths a lesson in psychological warfare, coordination, and disciplined courage. The beaches of Tsushima had been transformed into a living memory, echoed in castles, academies, patrols, and the hearts of every samurai who followed. And so the story closes not with the clash of swords or the roar of arrows, but with the enduring presence of a philosophy. The lesson of Tsushima, that courage must be coupled with discipline, that sacrifice can be a tool of strategy, that the smallest, most resolute force can shape the fate of millions, remained alive in every corner of Japan. Through the centuries, from the coastal watchtowers to the heart of Edo Castle, from training academies to the disciplined patrols of remote villages, the spirit of those 80 men endured. They had faced certain death to protect a nation, and in doing so, they had changed the course of history forever. Tsushima was more than a battle. It was the birth of a philosophy, the crystallization of strategy and honor, and the foundation upon which a nation built its resilience. 80 men against 20,000 had become the story of Japan itself. Disciplined, united, and invincible in spirit, prepared to face any challenge with courage, foresight, and unwavering resolve. The most successful military failure in history had become the enduring triumph of a civilization.